To compare two similar actions, you can use the form as, insert an adverb, and then use as again. So say, for example, the faucet drips slowly. Now, you want to give your reader a better idea of how slowly the faucet actually drips. So you can compare it to the dripping of molasses, which your reader probably knows is very slow. So you can use this form right here by saying the faucet drips as slowly as molasses. So you use as, you insert an adverb, and then you use as again. So now the reader has a better idea of how slowly the faucet actually drips. Now here it says strangers are treated as well as friends by Tim. So people can assume that Tim is going to treat his friends well. But people don't know how well he treats his strangers. So instead of just saying strangers are treated well by Tim, the writer can put strangers are treated as well as friends by Tim. So the writer is comparing two similar actions now. The action of him treating strangers and the action of him treating friends to show that Tim treats strangers very well. One final example is he never managed as successfully as his brother did. So here again we're comparing two similar actions. Apparently he managed something very successfully, and then his brother also managed. And so we're comparing how each of the brothers managed so we can see who managed better. So that's an example of adverb equal comparisons. Adverbs can be used to compare and contrast dissimilar actions. So the comparative form of a word is used to compare two actions, and the superlative form of a word is used to refer to one in a group of three or more that is the outstanding example of the action. So when we're dealing with one-syllable adverbs, we use the suffix er or est, or we use the words less or least. So say we have the word late. To get to the comparative form of the word late, we just add the suffix er to make it later. So if we have two people and one person is late by an hour and the other person is late by 2 hours, we would refer to the person late by 2 hours as being the later one. And then if we have three or more people and one person is late by 3 hours, we would refer to them as being the latest person. So that's the superlative form, latest. So we're just adding these suffixes, and really in later we're just adding r, and in latest we're just adding st because we already had e from late. Now to look at this in a more negative sense, you could use the words less or least. So you could refer to one person as being less late and another person as being the least late. Now, when you have an adverb with two or more syllables, you don't use a suffix anymore. You just use the words more or most or less or least. So we have the word carefully, and if two people both do something carefully, you would say that one person did it more carefully. And you could also say that one person did it less carefully, depending on how you want to look at it. And then also with the superlative form, if you have three or more, you would refer to one person as doing it the most carefully. And then you can refer to the person who wasn't very careful as being doing something the least carefully. Now we do have something called irregular adverbs, and what I mean by irregular is that they're irregular in the way you form the comparative and superlative forms of the adverb. So for example, we have the word well. Now the comparative form of the word well is better, and the superlative form is the best. So as you can see, better and best aren't in any way close to the word well. And so you just have to be familiar with these irregular adverbs and be familiar with how to form the comparative and superlative forms of those words. So again, adverbs can be used to compare and contrast dissimilar actions. And we use the comparative form when we're comparing two actions, and we use the superlative form when we're comparing three or more actions.
Today we want to go over just a few of the rules related to apostrophes and their use for showing possession of something. So you've got a noun that possesses something else, and you want to show possession. Sometimes it can be confusing to know where exactly to put that apostrophe. Before the S, after the S, to add an extra S. And so we just want to go over not all the rules related to the use of apostrophes, but just a few of the select ones. And I've got them on the board here behind me, so we're going to go over those briefly. Once again, apostrophes related to possession, not apostrophes in contractions or things like this, but to show possession. If there is a plural noun that ends in S, the apostrophe comes at the end, and there's no need to add an extra S. So when we think of the plural noun students, meaning more than one, and we want to talk about something that belongs collectively to the students, like their hats, the way you would write it is the students, apostrophe, hats. You would not include an extra S. It wouldn't be the students, apostrophe S, students' hats. It would just be the students' hats. Next, then, you have a plural noun that does not end in S. In this case, the apostrophe comes after the word, and then you do add an S. So in this case, the plural for man is men, and you want to talk about the men's meeting. So you put the word men, apostrophe, S, and meeting. So in the first one, it's a plural noun that ends in S. You just put the apostrophe and you're done. And the second one, the plural does not end in S, so you add the apostrophe, then the S, and what's possessed. And then finally, if you've got a singular noun that ends you've got a singular noun, it ends with the apostrophe S basically. So a singular noun, like our first one up here, we had a plural noun. The singular of students is student, and we want to talk about one student's hat, then we put the word student, apostrophe S, hat. So it mimics this rule here, number 2. So a singular noun, you end with apostrophe S, the student's hat. For names that end in S, proper names, things like that, you don't have to add another S at the end, but it is customary to do so. So when you talk about the Joneses' house or Texas's weather, the way you do it is the word Texas, apostrophe S, weather. Now it would be fine, it would be acceptable if you just put Texas, apostrophe, weather, and people would know it means Texas's weather. And the same with Jones. The Joneses' house, you would put Jones, apostrophe, S, or you could put Jones and then apostrophe. Either would be acceptable, so it's not required to put the extra S, but it is customary. Now, you never use an apostrophe when you're just talking about like the Joneses themselves in the plural. The Joneses went to Africa. In that case, you put Jones and then ES. You don't put an apostrophe there at all. But anyway, in terms of apostrophes and possession, just to review and hopefully make it clear, if it's a plural noun that ends in S, all you do is put the apostrophe on the end. Students, hats. If it's a plural noun that does not end in S, then you put an apostrophe S, men's meeting, mice's feet. If it's a singular noun, then you just put the noun apostrophe S to show possession. With formal things like Jones and Texas, just an apostrophe at the end is fine, but if you put an apostrophe S, that would actually be more customary. I hope this has been clear. If not, or you'd like to learn more about this, then underneath this video, if you look right beneath the video, there's a link there. If you'll click on that link, it'll take you to the website that has related information to this, more information about things related to this. And also on that website, you'll find a link there to an ebook that's ready for immediate download.
Conjunctions join words, phrases, and clauses, showing the relationship between them. So conjunctions join words, phrases, and clauses, and in addition, they show the relationship between these words, phrases, and clauses. And so there's some categories of conjunctions, including coordinating, correlative, and subordinating. And then there's conjunctive adverbs or transition words, which are another type of conjunction. But right now, we just want to focus on 2 of the main types of conjunctions, which are coordinating and correlative. And so these have similar definitions. The first is that they join grammatically equal words, phrases, or clauses. And so when we're talking about words, phrases, or clauses, we can be talking about 2 pronouns, 2 prepositional phrases, or 2 independent clauses, etc. And so those pronouns, prepositional phrases, or independent clauses are just being joined by coordinating conjunctions. And some examples of coordinating conjunctions are and, but, or, as well as nor. And then we have correlative conjunctions, which are used in pairs to join two or more words, phrases, or clauses that are grammatically equal. So you may be thinking that this is the same definition as we just looked at. Well, we still are talking about grammatically equal words, phrases, or clauses, but this time we're talking about them being used in pairs. So some examples of correlative conjunctions are both paired with and, not only, paired with but also, and then either paired with or. So notice each time I have 3 dots in between the 2 conjunctions. And so what that is signifying is that you have a conjunction, then you have words in between, and then another conjunction. And so when we talk about joining 2 or more words, phrases, or clauses, again, we can be talking about pronouns, prepositional phrases, independent clauses. So say, for example, you have 2 independent clauses. You could say both, then you put 1 independent clauses, and then you put and write another independent clause. And so you're using these conjunctions to join these 2 phrases, clauses, or words together. Adjective clauses and phrases are groups of words that collectively play the role of an adjective. So I want to take a look at examples of a clause and a phrase. So let's take a look at this first sentence. It says, "The car that is parked in the yard is mine." So I'm going to go ahead and tell you that this first example is an adjective clause. And adjective clauses contain both a subject and a verb. So the adjective clause in this sentence contains both a subject and a verb. So we're looking for this clause in this sentence. So like I said, adjective clauses collectively play the role of an adjective. So we're looking for a group of words that describe another word in the sentence. So if you look right here at "that is parked in the yard," it's marked off by commas. And "that is parked in the yard" plays the role, or could play the role, of an adjective because it's describing the word car. So if we look at this clause right here, we notice that it contains both a subject, "that," and "is," which is a verb. And parked is also a verb. So "that is parked in the yard." And so what is parked in the yard? The car is parked in the yard. So "that is parked in the yard" is further describing the word car. So this right here is an adjective clause. And adjectives can often be removed from a sentence, and the sentence will still make sense. And if you notice right here that this phrase or this clause right here is marked off by 2 commas. And any time a group of words is marked off by 2 commas, it can be removed from the sentence, and the sentence will still make sense. So take a look at this. Just X this out. We don't even read that, and we just read the sentence as "that," or "the car is mine." The sentence still makes sense without this adjective clause. And so that's another way to be able to tell that this is an adjective clause, because it can be removed from the sentence. Now, we've talked about adjective clauses, so as you can guess, this next example is going to be an adjective phrase. The sentence is very similar to the first, except it's missing 2 words. So those 2 words are "that" and "is." Instead of saying "that is parked in the yard," the sentence just picks up with "parked." It says "parked in the yard." So let's read the sentence as a whole. "The car parked in the yard is mine." So this right here is going to be the adjective phrase. Why? Because it doesn't contain both a subject and a verb. It's missing the subject, which is "that," and the verb, which is parked. Well, parked is still in this phrase, which is a verb, but it's missing part of its verb, which is, and it's missing a noun, or it's missing its subject, "that." So this phrase doesn't have a subject and a verb, so that's why we call it an adjective phrase, because phrases don't have both a subject and a verb. So "parked in the yard" is the adjective phrase because there's no one word in here that's describing car, but collectively these words make an adjective phrase which further describe the word car. The car parked in the yard. So "parked in the yard" is telling you where the car is parked. So there you've seen a quick preview to give you a better understanding of what adjective clauses and adjective phrases are and how they can be used. It is important to capitalize certain words according to grammar rules, because when you don't follow grammar rules and you capitalize a word you shouldn't, or you don't capitalize a word that you should, it becomes distracting to the reader because they may know that specific grammar rule. And capitalizing certain words helps the reader follow along with your train of thought, because it may help them realize when a sentence is beginning or when you're talking about a person's name. So we're going to look at this passage and identify the capitalization errors. So starting out, we're looking good. Then we go to the word January, and we see the J right there. The J is small, and it should be big. So that's one thing we should capitalize, months. Then we continue on to which was a Friday, and we find that the F isn't capitalized. So I'm going to write days. So you don't capitalize the word days, and you don't capitalize the word months, but you do capitalize months of the year, like January, February, December. You capitalize days of the week, like Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday. And then it says we went to the Museum of Science on a class trip. So museum and science both need to be capitalized because this is a specific place. You don't capitalize of because it's not an important word. So you need to capitalize museum and science. And then notice right here, class does not need to be capitalized because there's no reason why it needs to be capitalized. Now we go to this sentence, and the is not capitalized, even though it's the first letter of the first word of a sentence. So we need to capitalize the first word of a sentence. The class took a bus to the museum. Now you may be thinking that museum needs to be capitalized here as well because we capitalized it over here. But here we're talking about the Museum of Science. It's a specific museum. Here we're just talking about a museum in general, so it's not capitalized. It was a lot of fun. That sentence looks good. My teacher, Mrs. Jones, and some parents came with us. Now the first word of the sentence is capitalized, which is good. Jones is capitalized, which is the last name. We always capitalize last names. But then Mrs. isn't capitalized. And so you need to capitalize abbreviations before names. Abbreviations before names. And so those can be things like Dr., Mr., Ms., Mrs. All those abbreviations need to be capitalized. And so those are some examples of words that do need to be capitalized, but there are many other grammar rules out there, but those are some common words that are accidentally capitalized or accidentally not capitalized. Today we're going to talk about commas. Now commas have three main functions: to separate clauses, to join independent clauses, and to avoid confusion. So let's take a look at the first use, to separate clauses. This is when you need to separate a dependent clause from an independent clause, as is the case with this sentence. Michael went to the beach after he got ice cream. Michael went to the beach is the independent clause, and after he got ice cream is the dependent clause. Now, to test whether a clause is a dependent clause is just read that clause by itself. So if we were to read after he got ice cream, we would realize that's a dependent clause. It's dependent on the independent clause to make sense. Because if I just say after he got ice cream, that doesn't make very much sense. You're thinking, okay, what happened after he got ice cream? So Michael went to the beach is the independent clause because it can stand by itself, and after he got ice cream is the dependent clause. Now, dependent clauses can actually come before or after an independent clause. In fact, they can actually come inside the independent clause as well. So we could reverse this sentence, and we could say, after he got ice cream, Michael went to the beach. There again, after he got ice cream is still the dependent clause, and Michael went to the beach is still the independent clause. The sentence is just constructed differently. Now, a second use for commas is to join independent clauses. This is when basically you have two sentences that are closely related and you want to join them together. So if we were to say Taylor plays basketball, and then we also had another sentence, he enjoys running, we can easily join those two together. There's a couple ways to do that, but one of the ways is to use a comma and a conjunction. So we can say Taylor plays basketball, comma, and he enjoys running. The comma helps bring these two sentences together, and it helps you realize what's happening, that you're adding two sentences together. Now, the third use is to avoid confusion. There's a couple times when you want to do this. First would be when you're putting words in a list or items in a list. So if I were to say, I got a baseball, bike, and trampoline, I need commas to separate all three of the items. Now, sometimes you can leave the second comma off, and that can be fine as well. But you need at least one comma in here so people realize that it's a list. Because if I don't have a comma right here, it just looks like I got a baseball bike, and people are trying to figure out what is a baseball bike. Now, most people can pretty much figure out what you're trying to say, but a comma right there makes it so much easier for the reader because they can easily look at this and think, okay, you got a baseball, a bike, and a trampoline. Now, another time that you need a comma to avoid confusion is when someone just reading the sentence could easily get it mixed up, okay? So if I were to say, after we ate, our dad left for work, okay? So with the comma in here, it's easy to read that. After we ate, our dad went to work. The family was eating, they got finished, and the dad left for work, okay? But if the comma's not there, it can make it kind of confusing. The first time someone reads this, they're gonna think, after we ate, our dad left for work. And so they're thinking, wait, they ate their dad? No, of course not. And a reader eventually, yes, is probably going to figure out what the person's trying to convey that wrote the sentence. But it makes it so much easier if you have a comma right here, because it makes it so much easier for the reader to understand what's going on. And sometimes, in certain cases, if a writer leaves out a comma, it can make it very hard, almost impossible, for the reader to try to understand what the writer was trying to convey. And as a writer, anytime you're writing something, you want to convey things in such a way that people can easily read them and pick up what you're trying to convey. All right, so then again, commas, three main uses: to separate clauses, to join independent clauses, and to avoid confusion.
Drafting a thesis statement. The thesis statement expresses the main idea of a composition. It should encompass every idea, detail, and argument in that one thesis statement. It should all relate in some way to the thesis. So your thesis isn't going to list out all of your arguments and details that you're going to have in your composition, but it should relate in some way to all of them. A thesis can be kind of tricky because you want it to be general enough to encompass everything that's going to be in your paper, but specific enough that the reader knows what your main idea is. It should be a short declarative statement, but it should not be vague. It needs to be specific. It can't just be a general subjective sentence that doesn't really tell the reader what's going on. The thesis statement should suggest the content of the rest of the piece so the audience knows what to expect. And if you're too vague, the audience isn't going to know what to expect. So you have to be specific without being too specific, and general without being too general. So I'll give you a few examples so you can see how to balance these things and draft an effective thesis statement. The principal is basically a nice guy. It tells you the principal's nice, but there are lots of things you could talk about that would make the principal a nice guy. This is a pretty vague statement, so let's improve upon that. Let's get more specific and give the reader more of an idea of what the content of your piece is going to be. The principal's policies demonstrate his care for students. So now, the reason we think he's a nice guy is because it's obvious that he cares for his students based on his policies. So we're not talking about the principal being a nice guy because he coaches Little League or he just says hi to you in the hallway. It's because he has policies at school that show that he cares about his students. So this is an effective thesis statement. This is a good one. This one is too vague. We had to get more specific. So let's look at another example. Dogs are good pets. Well, not everyone's going to think that, but at least if you give them more information, they may see your side of things. Saying dogs are good pets is still really vague. You need to get more specific. Why do you think they're good pets? But don't get too specific because you want your main idea to be in your thesis statement, but you don't want all the supporting details to be there. You want to save those for the body of your paper. So let's look at this as if this is an effective thesis statement example, changing dogs are good pets, which is still too vague, to something more effective. Because of its sense of loyalty, its ability to be trained, and its good companionship, a dog is the perfect pet for me. Now, this thesis does actually tell you what your main subtopics are probably going to be. You'll probably have a body paragraph talking about a dog's sense of loyalty, another one about how easy they are to train, and another one about how they are good companions. This kind of thesis statement is also okay because it gets specific, but not too specific. It tells what your subtopics are going to be, what your supporting overall ideas are going to be, but it doesn't get into every detail and argument that you're going to present in your composition. So this would be another good example. So one of the main things to remember when writing your thesis statement is to include the main idea of your paper, let the reader understand what they should expect from the rest of your paper, but don't be too vague or too specific. Try to focus on a short declarative statement that tells the overall idea of your paper without giving it all away.
Fragments and run-on sentences. A fragment is an incomplete sentence or thought that cannot stand on its own. And it can't stand on its own and is incomplete because it's missing either a noun or a verb. So let's look at some examples of fragments. The beautiful blooming daisies in my yard. Now this is a lot of information. The beautiful blooming daisies in my yard. But you have your noun, some adjectives to describe it, an article adjective, and then you've got a prepositional phrase that tells you where they are. But you're missing something. You're missing the verb. So this one is a fragment. So you can have a longer sentence or a longer fragment that looks like a sentence and still have it be a fragment because it's missing either the noun or the verb. So we had our noun, but we were missing our verb. So even though it looks long and looks like it could be a sentence, don't be fooled by the length of a fragment because just because a phrase is long doesn't mean it's a complete sentence. Let's look at another example. Waited all day at my house for you. In this sentence, we have an action, waiting, so we've got our verb. All day at my house for you. Well, you see some pronouns in there, but there's no noun. There's no subject of this sentence, so you're missing a subject noun in this one. So it's still a fragment. You've got the verb part, you've got the predicate part of your sentence, but you don't have the subject part. So this is a fragment. It is not a complete sentence. So when you're looking for fragments, look for either a missing verb or missing noun, because if you're missing one of those, then your fragment cannot stand on its own and will not be a complete sentence. In your writing, you'll need to revise. You need to revise these, and often you can just add a little bit to a fragment to make it a complete sentence. The beautiful blooming daisies in my yard look so nice this time of year. Smell wonderful. are going to win the contest. You can finish the sentence in any way. Waited all day at my house for you. You could say, we waited all day at my house for you. I waited. My mom and I waited. It's a little bit more limited what you could put at the beginning of this sentence because we've got my and you for pronouns down here. But you still have options, and you could easily turn this fragment into a complete sentence. Now let's look at run-on sentences. A run-on sentence is a sentence that should be written as two sentences. It's too long. It contains too much information and is confusing to the reader. And if it's running on and on and on, then it's likely there's not correct punctuation and there's too many nouns and too many verbs crammed into one sentence. So you need to break it up so that you've got separate complete thoughts and it's easier for the reader to understand. Let's look at these examples of run-on sentences and then correct them. I couldn't believe it when I heard that there were going to be thunderstorms tomorrow. I was planning on having a barbecue outside to celebrate summer. This is a lot of information, so we need to see where one thought ends and another one starts so that we can split it up. I couldn't believe it. Well, we want to know what she couldn't believe. I couldn't believe it when I heard that there were going to be thunderstorms tomorrow. So all that is one thought. So we're going to separate this and put a period, and we would need to capitalize the next letter, but since it was I, it was automatically capitalized. I was planning on having a barbecue outside to celebrate summer. Now we have two complete sentences. They're separate, it's not too much information in each sentence, and it's not going to be confusing to the reader. I couldn't believe it when I heard that there were going to be thunderstorms tomorrow. I was planning on having a barbecue outside to celebrate summer. So now, it's not so confusing. It doesn't just run on and on and on. We didn't have so many subjects and so many verbs in one sentence. Now we've separated it out and made it easier for the reader to understand right away. Let's look at our next example. John and Mary had so much fun they went to the fair and rode rides and ate cotton candy. Now this one, we need to find where we need to split it up. We have another run-on sentence. We've got a lot of actions, but we need to see where we could split it up to keep the subject and verb of one sentence and the subject and verb of a second sentence and make it two complete sentences. We don't want to split it up incorrectly and leave a fragment somewhere. John and Mary. Let's look at what they did. John and Mary had so much fun, they. When we get to they, that's a new pronoun. That's a new subject. So we should stop there. John and Mary had so much fun. And then, if we're starting a new sentence, we need to capitalize our T in they. John and Mary had so much fun. They went to the fair and rode rides and ate cotton candy. So now, we have two complete thoughts. First, we're saying they had fun, and then we're saying how they had fun. And we didn't keep it a run-on sentence to where we had this pronoun in the middle of this sentence, making it sound a little confusing. We have John and Mary having fun, and then they went to the fair and rode rides and ate cotton candy. So we split it up into two sentences that are easier to understand. And you also would want to revise any run-on sentences in your writing. If you see a sentence that's going on and on for 3 or 4 lines, you probably need to find somewhere in there to break it up so that it isn't a run-on sentence. You can have sentences that are more complex if you're using semicolons, etc., but you don't want it to be so long that there are too many ideas in one sentence. So when you're writing, make sure you don't have any incomplete thoughts that are missing a noun or verb. We don't want any fragments in your writing, and make sure that none of your sentences are going on so long and including too much information that it makes it a run-on sentence.
General revision and proofreading. After you're done composing your paper, you want to work on general revision and final proofreading before you're completely done with it. So with general revision, once you've completed your draft, you want to set it aside. Now you may not always be able to do this, but if you can, you should, because you're going to be the best reviser if you can be detached and objective. And if you're in the heat of the moment from writing that composition, you're not going to be as willing to set aside some of your ideas or rearrange the paper as if you could come back with a clear mindset and you're more detached. So once you're able to come back to your paper as an objective party, look at the document as a whole. Look at the whole essay, the whole composition, and ask yourself these questions. Does it address the intended audience? You were supposed to know who you were writing to. You should have been aiming at a specific audience. Was it for children? Was it for adults? Was it for peers? Was it for your teacher? Was it for a supervisor? You want it to address the intended audience. Is it written to that level of style? Is the tone correct? Is the language you used appropriate? So you want to make sure it addresses the intended audience. And does it have proper organization? Now this just means, are the body paragraphs in the best order they can be? Your thesis and your introductory paragraph are going to stay at the beginning. Your conclusion's going to stay at the end. But your body paragraphs may be better suited in a different order. You may say, oh, I want to move this middle one to the beginning because I think it makes a strong first supporting point for me. Oh, I want to move this last one up to the middle and move the first one to the bottom because it's really strong too, and I want it to close out my paper as the last supporting detail. So you may see all that whenever you're going over your general revision phase and move through and move some of the body paragraphs around in your paper. And that's fine. That's what this step of the writing process is for. Now with research papers, another thing you want to do during general revision is to check your citations and references. You've cited some of your references in your paper. So go back to where you've cited them, make sure you've done it correctly. Go back to your references, make sure you have them in the correct format. You don't want to get that far into your paper and then realize you don't have the correct reference or you cited something incorrectly. So make sure you check that during the general revision phase. So this phase was about looking at the draft as a whole, making sure it was addressing the topics and audience it was supposed to, and that it's in an organizational pattern that makes sense. Final proofreading is different. It's a slow, careful check for typographical and grammatical errors. So this is going to be a little bit different. Now you're fine-tooth combing this thing and you're looking for more targeted, small errors that will distract the reader. You're not looking to reorganize the paper. You should have that done already. This is about fixing little nitpicky errors that would distract the reader from your message because they find this little misspelled word or this word that isn't the correct word to be used. So on that note, I want you to beware the spell check feature. Most likely you will be typing your final draft, and you should not rely solely on the spell check feature of most Word programs to correct your paper completely. Using words like their, possessive, versus their, place in space, the spell check feature won't find these as incorrect words. These are spelled correctly, but if you use the wrong one, people are going to notice that and it's going to bug them. They're going to say, oh, they used the wrong there. Well, spell check isn't going to catch that. You have to catch that whenever you're doing your grammatical error check during final proofreading. Just another example, weather versus weather. These are both words that are spelled correctly. But if I said, oh, what's the weather out like today? Or if I was talking about whether or not I thought it would snow today, it would not be the correct use of the word, even though it's spelled correctly. So make sure you are reading through your paper looking for grammatical errors. Don't just assume it's all okay because of the spell check feature. Whenever you go to revise your final draft, you've completed it, you've got everything written down, you've got it narrowed down to the sentences you want to use in your composition, do a general revision where you're looking at the paper as a whole and make sure it addresses the audience and topics that it was supposed to, and make sure it's organized to where it makes the most sense and it will be the most effective at getting your message out. If it's a research paper, check your citations of references. And then do your final proofreading and look for small errors that will distract your reader, because you don't want something small to distract your reader from the overall message of your paper. Historical context. Historical context can impact literature in a number of ways. The author's writing can be impacted by the historical period during which it was written, or the historical setting of the story. For instance, when Charles Dickens was writing, he was writing during a period where authors were paid by the word, which meant that his novels were very, very long. And that was a result of the time period during which his work was written. He was writing long novels because he knew he would get paid more for every word that he wrote. Dialect is something else you can pay attention to. The dialect could be what the author is used to using in his everyday life, or the dialect could be more related to the historical setting of the story. So dialect is something you want to pay attention to and ask yourself, is this the dialect used during the setting, or is this more of just the author using his own personal dialect that he's used to? Another thing to pay attention to with historical setting is major events that are going on. You want to be familiar with the time period during which a story is set so you can have a better understanding of it. So, one example is the Civil War. During the Civil War, slavery was the normal thing in the South. And whenever the Civil War is over, lots of slaves, or people that used to be slaves, wanted to tell their story. And so what came about were slave narratives. And these painted a picture of what slave life was actually like during that time. It was an actual account from that time period. And it kind of also told the relationship between slaves and slaveholders. So that source of writing is very valuable, and it's become one of the most important literary genres for African American writers. Today, people may still write from that perspective in that time period, but the actual slave narratives that gave first-hand accounts were very important. Another thing to pay attention to with Civil War writing, slave narratives, anything from that time period are the themes. A lot of times you'll see themes of power, race, inequality. Because when slavery ended, it was because people were saying, your skin color doesn't make you more or less of a person, or a better or worse person. Everyone's equal. And while equal rights didn't come about till later, it started that theme of equality around the Civil War time. Another major event that's common is World War II. There are countless novels based around World War II events, whether it's based in Nazi Germany, whether it's based in America, as people are dealing with what was going on here. But one of the biggest things that you'll see is the topic of genocide, destroying a whole race. So your Jewish Nazi relations, you're going to see a lot of. Anne Frank, very, very popular book, one that most people are going to know about, was based on this. And if you know the World War II era, then you know what to expect when you're reading. You know that the Nazis are trying to take over most of Europe. You know that the Jews are being persecuted, and you've already got that bit of background knowledge before you even read the rest of the book. And with World War II novels, you're again going to see themes of race, power, and democracy, because in the end, people were going to say that having a government where some totalitarian dictator took over everything wasn't the best way to be. And you're going to see people highlighting the pros of democracy. So whenever you're reading, really pay attention to the historical context of the story. because the historical period during which it was written is always going to have an impact, and the historical setting is going to be very important for you to understand so that you can understand why the author gave the character certain motivations and why the author carried out the plot as they did. Parallelism. Parallelism means writing with a parallel structure. That means all nouns, verbs, and phrases should have the same structure. Let's look at some examples to see what that means. In example 1, John runs fast and plays hard. There we have multiple verbs, runs and plays. So they should be parallel. They should have the same structure. And both runs and plays are simple third person present tense verbs. So they are simple verbs. They don't have any suffixes. They're third person. We're talking about John. You're not saying I did this. You're saying John did this, talking about someone else. And it's present tense. He's running and playing right now. He runs and plays in the present. So they agree. Both runs and plays are simple third person present tense verbs. So they have parallel structure. So this one is good. Let's look at example 2. My hobbies are playing the piano, running marathons, and reading books. So we have 3 phrases there, but they all start with verbs. So let's look at those. Playing the piano, running marathons, reading books. This sentence also has correct verb structure. Playing, running, and reading are all present tense, and they all have ing as a suffix for them. If this sentence didn't have parallel verb structure, it would seem awkward and disjointed. Think about it. If it said, my hobbies are playing the piano, run marathons, and read books, it wouldn't make sense because you've got one with ing, one that's present tense, and one that's past tense. They all have to agree. They all have to have the same structure. They need to be the same tense. They need to be the same, have the same suffix, or all not have a suffix. And all these things are important whenever you're writing a sentence that is more complex than just something with one subject or one noun and one verb. If you have multiple nouns, verbs, or phrases, you need to make sure they have parallel structure. So again, this one was good, but if it wasn't, it wouldn't sound very good. It would sound awkward and disjointed. Let's look at example 3. When we went to the beach, we spent the whole day swimming in the water, building sandcastles, and we took walks on the beach. This one was another one with 3 verb phrases. When we went to the beach, we spent the whole day swimming in the water, building sandcastles, and we took walks along the beach. Swimming and building are both present tense with ing endings, but took is past tense. It does not have the ing, and it makes our sentence sound disjointed. So this one needs to be revised. So let's talk about some ways we can do that. We already have swimming and building, so we could make that last phrase agree with the first one. If we do that, we could say, we spent the whole day swimming in the water, building sandcastles, and taking walks along the beach. And that is one correct way to fix this. Now, that isn't the only way. Let's look at another way, because whenever you're trying to find parallel structure, you don't necessarily have to make it all match the first verb that you come to or the first noun that you come to. You just have to make them all have the same structure. So if we took them all out and we came up with a different way, we could say, when we went to the beach, we're going to take out even more of it to make this one make sense. When we went to the beach, we swam in the water, built sandcastles, and took walks along the beach. So in this one, instead of leaving The first two in the present tense with ing suffix, we changed them all to match that last verb, which was past tense. But we took out having we here because we already had we at the beginning. We didn't need to keep repeating we. We could just make the phrases go after it and have parallel structure so that they made sense. So another way to fix a sentence was to say, when we went to the beach, we swam in the water, built sandcastles, and took walks along the beach. So we changed them all to past tense, and now they match and have parallel structure. So now we've revised it, and it's good. So whenever you're writing, make sure that your writing has parallelism. You want to make sure that all the nouns, verbs, or phrases have the same structure so that your writing makes sense and doesn't sound awkward or disjointed. Point of view. The point of view is the perspective from which a story is told, and the narrator is the person who tells the story. So when we're looking for point of view, we're looking to see if we have a first-person narrator or a third-person narrator that's telling us the story. In first person, your narrator is going to be your main character, and they're going to be saying I, me, we. These are the pronouns you're going to see associated with the first-person narrator. If it's the main character, you're only going to get to know what the main character knows. You're only going to get to read about what that main character does or what he does with someone else. But you won't know about anything that doesn't happen involving the main character because this is written from a first-person point of view and you're only going to hear from this viewpoint. Third person is the most common point of view. And you're going to see pronouns like he, she, and they. The narrator is going to talk about other characters, but the narrator is not one of the characters. And third person omniscient is very common as well. Omniscient means all-knowing. So a third person omniscient narrator is going to be one who describes all other characters. So, at once. So this narrator is going to be able to tell you what every other character in the story is thinking, what every other character in the story is doing. Now they may not actually do it all in the same passage. Sometimes they split it into chapters. So one chapter is written to where the author is telling you everything that Johnny does. One chapter is split to tell you everything that Susie does. So you find out everyone's point of view, but possibly at different times. But the author is able to do all that without actually being a part of the story. So whenever you're looking for who your narrator is, the pronouns are the important thing to look at. Let's look at this passage. John walked to school every day. He and his friends were often cold and tired by the time they arrived. They were allowed to warm up by the stove before sitting in their seats. In this passage, let's look at the pronouns to help determine the point of view. And your pronouns are going to be words that take the place of nouns, such as I, me, we, he, she, they, it, you. But these are going to be the ones that are really going to set you off as markers to let you know if it's a first person or third person narrator that you're listening to. So looking through this, we have he and his friends. By the time they arrived, they were allowed to warm up by the stove before sitting in their seats. And it started with John. So the narrator is using he and they and someone's name. Now, first person could use someone's name, and that's why it's important to look at the pronouns. But the narrator starts talking about John, and then he uses all of these third person pronouns. The narrator is a third person narrator here. Oh, let's write it out. Third person. And you know this because you're looking at the pronouns. And the pronouns are all telling you that the narrator is telling you what's happening, but the narrator is not a part of the action. So the point of view is a third person point of view. So whenever you're going to find point of view, you want to know this because the perspective of the story who it's coming from is important. If it's coming from a certain character, or if it's coming from a first person or a third person point of view, then you're going to have a different plot or have information, more intimate information in first person and a greater variety of information with third person. So it's always important to determine your point of view whenever you are reading a story. So just keep in mind that the best way to find that is by looking at the pronouns. I, me, and we, he, she, and they.
Quotation marks are used to show that the words inside the quotation marks are someone else's, not the writer's own. So look at this sentence. Come over here, Joe said. So the quotation marks right here and right here are conveying that the writer did not say come over here. Joe said come over here. So notice a few things about a sentence that has a quote in it. First, you open up the sentence with quotation marks. Then you capitalize the first letter of the first word inside the quotation marks. And then if you have a sentence that is declarative or imperative, any sentence that would end with a period, if it was on its own, you end that sentence with a comma, then you have quotation marks, and then you say the rest of the sentence. So this sentence says, where did he go? Notice we open up with quotation marks, capitalize the W, but if where did he go stood by itself, it would have a question mark because it's a question. So we put a question mark right here and then close with the quotation marks. Notice that the question mark is included inside the quotation marks. It's not on the outside, it's on the inside. This sentence says, there he is, he exclaimed. So in this case, the person's saying it with a lot of emotion, so that's why we ended with an exclamation mark. Now these next couple sentences are kind of inverted from the sentences we've been looking at because the quote comes later in the sentence. So this sentence says, Michael said, I can't wait for dinner. So you put a comma after said, open up with quotation marks, go through the sentence, and then this sentence right here is declarative, so it ends with a period. And up here we ended with a comma, but here we're ending with a period because we've come to the end of the sentence, and there needs to be some kind of period or question mark or exclamation mark to end out the sentence. So in this case, a period is chosen to end the sentence, and then quotation marks are put at the end. Notice that the period is inside the quotation marks. This sentence says, Michael asked, what's for dinner? In this case, it's a question, so that's why we have a question mark at the end. Again, notice that it's inside the quotation marks. Now this final sentence is kind of unique. It says, I think we are having burgers, Michael said. Do you know what we are having? So right here, there's two quotes within one sentence. So it says, I think we are having burgers. So we open up with quotation marks. We have the quote right here. We end with a comma because this is a declarative sentence. Then we have another set of quotation marks. Then we have something outside of the quotes because we're saying that Michael said this. And then we continue on with what Michael said. So we open up with quotation marks. And it says, do you know what we are having? This is a question, so we use a question mark. And then we end with quotation marks. So those are the important things you need to remember when using quotation marks. After you've written a rough draft, it's important to read back over that paper and improve it, to revise and edit it in order to make it better. Now, in order to make that paper better, you need to read all of that paper again. You need to look over every single paragraph to reread everything that you've written. So one thing you need to look for is you need to check for errors in spelling and punctuation. So by checking for errors in spelling and punctuation, you're going to be improving your writing. The second thing you need to look for is you need to look at paragraph structure. So in some circumstances, you may come across a paragraph that's really long, and so you might need to cut that paragraph into 2 paragraphs. Or you may need to rearrange the order of paragraphs to help make the writing make more sense. A third thing you need to do is make sure the writing is clear. You want to look for clear writing. You don't want the reader to have to ask, what does this mean? You want the writing to speak for itself, making it very clear and easy to understand. So one thing you may need to do to make sure your writing is clear is So you might need to check to see if something has to be added or taken out. Fourth thing is you want there to be a natural flow in your writing. You don't want the reader to have to keep bouncing around your paper, rereading things to understand what you're saying, because you want there to be a natural flow. You want the writing to progress easily and naturally. The next point is you want to check for supporting details. In other words, it's not enough just to have an opinion. You need to have some details to back up that opinion. Any ideas that are brought up should have enough support behind them. Then finally, you need to reread the draft. So you initially wrote this paper, and then you read it again to check for all these errors, and then you want to reread it a second time. In other words, you want to revise and edit it twice, because sometimes you're going to notice something the second time that you would have not noticed the first time. So you want to make the changes that are needed, and then make sure the purpose of the writing is clear. The semicolon is a punctuation mark with a variety of uses. Here are some of them: to separate items in a series that contain commas, to join independent clauses, and to join independent clauses along with a transitional phrase. So let's look at the first example: to separate items in a series that contain commas. An example would be, some state capitals include Boston, Massachusetts, Austin, Texas, and Oklahoma City, Oklahoma. Now, generally, when you have items in a list, you separate them by commas. But since I already have a comma in Boston, Massachusetts in that phrase, if I were to put another comma right here, the reader would get very confused and think that Boston, Massachusetts, Austin, Texas, Oklahoma City, and Oklahoma were all state capitals, where in reality only Boston, Austin, and Oklahoma City are state capitals. So when you have a comma that's internal within the item, then you separate the items with semicolons like we have here. A third case, or a second case, of when you use semicolons is to join independent clauses. So here we have, Jordan started doing homework, semicolon, he had to stop for dinner. These are two independent clauses. These are basically just two sentences that we join together. In this case, the sentences need to be very closely related. Like I wouldn't say Jordan started doing homework, he ate cereal. They need to go together. In this case, the reader can follow the writer's train of thought. Jordan started doing homework, but then he had to stop doing homework for dinner. They need to go together. The third case would be to join independent clauses along with a transitional phrase. So transitional phrases would be like, however. So she has a broken leg, semicolon, however, comma, she is usually industrious. So there's a variety of transitional phrases like however, of course, or thus, along with many more. And so you would use a semicolon, then you use the transitional word or the phrase, and then you put a comma after that phrase. So there you go. Those are the three ways to use semicolon: to separate items in a series that contain commas, to join independent clauses, as well as to join independent clauses that are also joined with a transitional phrase. Authors use language and word choice to convey a certain style, tone, and mood in a piece of literature. So style, tone, and mood are all different, but they're somewhat similar. They have to do with the way the author writes, the words they use, and the way they grammatically structure their pieces of writing. So first we're going to take a look at style, but notice it has 2 bullet points because the purpose of style is twofold. So one purpose of style is to be appropriate to the purpose of the text. So if there's a piece of writing that's really serious, then the style of writing is going to be very serious. It's going to use serious words in a serious, straightforward grammatical structure. But if it's meant to be comical, the piece of writing is meant to be comical, then the writing is going to be more relaxed and the grammatical structure is going to be more relaxed. And the second purpose of style is basically a way to set an author apart. It's a way to set authors apart. Every author is going to have their own particular style. It's going to be certain tendencies they have in their writing. Maybe they use a certain word a lot, or they structure a lot of their sentences the same way, or they develop the plot the same way in most of their stories. Well, that sets each author apart, and many times authors want their writing to set them apart from other writers. And sometimes this style is so strong that you could read a piece of writing and not know who wrote it, but guess who wrote it because of the style. Now, the second thing we're going to talk about is tone, which is the author's attitude toward the subject. And so basically, this is the author's attitude towards whatever the author is writing about. And so many times you can tell through the writing whether the author is for or against something. So sometimes an author might write something that's like a persuasive essay. And in that case, it's going to be very obvious what their attitude towards the subject at hand is, because they're trying to persuade you one way or the other. But sometimes an author just writes an informative text. But you can still often tell what their tone is, because whether they're trying to or not, many times they'll word things certain ways that can tell you how they feel about something. And so that's the tone. Now the mood is like the tone, but it's for the reader. And so basically it's the feeling the work invokes in the reader. So here we talked about the author's attitude towards the subject. We could define mood as the reader's attitude towards the subject. It's how the piece of writing makes the reader feel after reading it. So you can see how style, tone, and mood are similar in that they all pertain to the word choice and the particular language that is used. But they're also different, because style pertains to the purpose of the text, and then the tone is concerned with the author's attitude towards the subject, and the mood is concerned with the reader's attitude towards the subject, or basically the way the piece of writing makes the reader feel. Subordinating conjunctions are words or group of words that make one part of the sentence dependent on the rest of the sentence. Take a look at what I mean. This sentence says the organization will exist as long as there is ample funding. As long as is the subordinating conjunction in this sentence. Now, the organization will exist could be a sentence by itself. You put a period right there. And there is ample funding could also be a sentence by itself. Those two sentences could stand alone. But when we add to this first sentence, the organization will exist as long as, it makes the rest of the sentence, or it makes that sentence dependent on something else. Because if we were just to say the organization will exist as long as, that leaves us hanging. That's a fragment. It needs some other words to go along with it to make it a complete sentence. So the organization will exist as long as there is ample funding. So as long as is the subordinating conjunction, making the first part of the sentence dependent on something else to complete the sentence. Let's look at one more example. Since it is noon, let's eat lunch. Since right here is the subordinating conjunction. Remember, I said a subordinating conjunction can be one word or a group of words. So up here, it was 3 words. Sometimes the subordinating conjunction is 2 words, and then often it is just 1 word, like since. So here it says, since it is noon, let's eat lunch. Now again, let's eat lunch could be a sentence by itself, and it is noon could be a sentence by itself. But when we add since to it is noon, it makes this part of the sentence dependent on some other words to complete the sentence. Because if we just said, since it is noon, that wouldn't make any sense. That would be a fragment because it's incomplete. So a subordinating conjunction makes the rest of the sentence dependent on something else to complete it. That way, since it is noon, let's eat lunch makes sense.
Transitional words and phrases. Transitional words and phrases are used to guide the reader through the text. You've probably seen a lot of these common transitional words and phrases before, but you may not have thought about what their operation is, what their purpose is in the paper. So let's look at the different ways transitions can be used. You can have transitions that show time information. For instance, after, before, during, in the middle of. These all tell you when in time something is happening. You can also have transitions that indicate an example is about to be given. For example, in fact, for instance, if you say something, if you state your main idea and then you want to give a supporting example, you can say, in fact, let me tell you this thing. For example, dogs make good pets because they are very loyal. These phrases let you know that an example is coming. Transitions can be used for comparing. Also, likewise, you're saying how two things are alike. This is also like this. Likewise, we can look at how dogs are good companions. You can also use them for contrasting, saying how two things are different. However, but, yet, you would like a dog for a pet because they are so companionable, but a cat is not going to be as affectionate. They won't make as good of a companion as a dog. So you can contrast two things using however, but, yet. Transitions can be used to suggest addition, to let you know that more is coming, and also furthermore. These all let you know more is coming, more examples are coming, more information is coming, more details of the same sort. You can have transitions that reflect logical relationships. If, then, therefore, as a result, since. If I go to bed late, I might be tired in the morning. I went to bed late, therefore, I was tired in the morning. So these transitions reflect logical relationships. And our last example for transitional words and phrases are steps in a process. And these words show that exactly. They're showing steps in a process. First, you'll gather up all your ingredients. Second, you'll mix the dry ingredients in a bowl. Last, you'll take the cake out of the oven. So these steps are telling you exactly what's happening first, second, third. They may throw in next after that. They may not want to just put numbered all the time. Like last isn't telling you the 10th step, it just uses the transitional word last, but it still is giving you an idea of what step that is in a process. So make sure you use your transitional words and phrases where they will orient your reader and illuminate the structure of your composition. You want to let your readers know where they are in your paper. If you're saying first, this happens, next, this happens, or if it's steps in a process, first you do this, second you do this. Or if you're comparing and contrasting things, you would say, well, here's this, likewise, there's this. However, there's this if you're contrasting. And you want to illuminate the structure of your composition. If you're writing a compare and contrast essay, these compare and contrast transitional words are going to help highlight that that's what type of essay you're writing. If you're writing a persuasive essay, you might see a lot of examples. If you're writing an instructional essay, you'll see a lot of steps in a process. If you're writing an informational essay, you may have some logical relationships. So using these transitional words and phrases can help let your reader know what the purpose of your writing was. So please always include transitional words and phrases in your writing because you want to guide your reader through the text and let them know what your purpose is.
Sometimes choosing the correct pronoun can be difficult. Consider this sentence. Ron and blank left. So here, you either need to insert the pronoun Ron and I left or Ron and me left. So how do you choose the correct one? Well, I'll go ahead and tell you that the correct response is I. The sentence should read, Ron and I left. Now, there is a grammatical way to come to that conclusion, but there's an easy trick to figure it out. Try removing the first noun in the sentence. So if we remove Ron and then we just read the sentence like this, it's much more easy to figure out which pronoun to use. We can read the sentence two ways. We can try I left, or we can say me left. Me left obviously is not grammatically correct. So the correct pronoun here must be I left. So then that means we can plug I into the sentence, and the sentence makes sense, like Ron and I left. All right, let's look at another option, or another example. He gave Ron and blank a gift. He gave Ron and blank a gift. So here, do we insert the pronoun I or me? Well, let's try the trick again and remove Ron and from the sentence. So we can try it two ways. Once by inserting the pronoun I, and once by inserting the pronoun me. He gave me a gift. Or we could read it as, he gave I a gift. Here, I does not sound grammatically correct. So me must be the correct response, because he gave me a gift sounds grammatically correct. So me is the correct pronoun to insert in the blank. So the sentence now reads, he gave Ron and me a gift. And that is the correct way to do it. So again, the more you get familiar with these pronouns, the easier it will be to determine which pronoun to use. But you can always use the trick of eliminating one of the nouns in the sentence to figure out which pronoun you need. Notice one more thing, that I always put the pronouns second, because in this case, these sentences were referring to the speaker. So say these sentences are referring to myself. Out of respect for the other person, you should always put yourself last in the order of people. So it wouldn't be correct to say, I and Ron left, or he gave me and Ron a gift. It always is grammatically correct to put yourself after the other people in the sentence. Understanding verb tenses is critical because verb tenses are used to show when a verb took place. So if you use the wrong verb, it makes your writing very confusing. So I'm going to look at 4 verb tenses. I have them written up here on the board. First one is the past tense. Then we have the present tense, the future tense, and the past participle tense. So I want to look at 2 verbs and see what they would look like in the different tenses. So first we have the past tense. Think about the verb walk. What would be the past tense of the verb walk? It would be walked. So even if I didn't have all this other stuff about verb tenses written up here on the board, and we just had the verb walked, anyone could look at that and know that that means that that happened in the past. He walked down the street. That verb right there is indicating that he walked in the past. All right, let's look at the present tense of the verb walked. It would be the verb walks. Now, present tense means that whatever is happening is occurring now. Now, it doesn't always mean that it's happening right now. So, like, think about the verb walks. If we say he walks to school, that doesn't necessarily mean that he is walking on the road right now headed to school. It just means that every day, currently, he walks to school. Let's look at the future tense. It will be will walk. That's the future tense of the verb walk. He will walk down the street. Again, you can just look at will walk and know that means something will happen in the future. Past participle is used to show that something happened in the past before something else happened. So it's going to be similar to the past tense, but just a little bit different. We're actually going to add what's called an auxiliary verb or a helping verb, which is the verb has. So we're going to say has walked. So up here, we would just say he walked down the street. Now we're saying he has walked down the street. It's showing that that happened in the past before something else happened. Now let's look at one more verb. How about the verb do? So the past would be did. as in he did that. The present tense would be does, as in he does that. The future tense will be will do. He will do that. And the past participle would be has done, as in he has done that. So again, it's critical that you understand verb tenses and that you apply what you know about verb tenses to use the correct verb tense in all of your writing. What is an adjective? Through this session, I want to find the answer to that question. Now, I know you are probably familiar with the term adjective, but I want to look more specifically at what an adjective is and how it can be used. So let's take a look at this first example. I like that green car. Now, the general definition of an adjective is a word that describes or modifies another word in the sentence. So in order to identify the adjective in this sentence, we're looking for a word that is describing another word. So if we look through this sentence, we notice that green car is in this sentence. And you can quickly realize that green is the adjective in this sentence. Why? Because green can't stand alone in this sentence. Green must be modifying or describing car. It's saying, I like that car that is green. Green is describing what kind of car is there. Let's go on to another example. My mom makes delicious food. Again, we're looking for a word that is describing another word in the sentence. So if you were to read this sentence and stop right here, you would read the sentence as, my mom makes delicious. So we can quickly realize that delicious can't stand alone in this sentence. So delicious must be describing something else. So we can just look at the next word in the sentence, food. My mom makes delicious food. So delicious is obviously describing what kind of food is here. Now I said that delicious can't stand alone here. And I was right. I mean, if food is gone, it says mom makes delicious. That doesn't make any sense. Now that is not always the case with adjectives. Like in this sentence, if I said I like that green, and we left car out, and the sentence just said I like that green, it still makes sense because the reader or the speaker or the writer of this word could simply be talking about that they like a certain shade of green. But a lot of times you can find an adjective because it can't stand alone in the sentence. Let's take a look at this next example. How much income tax do you have to pay? Now, this adjective is not as easy to find as other adjectives we've been looking at. So let's look closely at this sentence. We're continuing through this sentence, just one word at a time. How much income tax? Now, if you stop right here, you realize that income is describing tax. A lot of times, an adjective answers a question, like who, what, wow, when. So in other words, we're saying, like, what kind of tax is here? It's an income tax. What kind of food is here? It's delicious food. What kind of car is it? It's a green car. So a lot of times if you look at a certain noun in a sentence and you ask, what kind is it? Or ask some kind of question similar to that, you can find the adjective because the adjective is answering a question about another word in the sentence because it's further describing that other word. So if we look at tax right here, income is the adjective further describing tax because this could be a sales tax or a gift tax. But in this case, it's an income tax. So income is the adjective. Let's take a look at another example. They are here for an annual meeting. So, quick side note. There are words called articles. An example of articles are a, an, and the. So those three words are articles. Articles are also adjectives. So anytime you see the words a, an, or the, they're called articles and they are adjectives. So if we look at this sentence, it says they are here for an annual meeting. So boom, right here we see an, which is an article. So it must be an adjective. So what is an describing? Is it describing annual? No, it's describing meeting because we could take annual out and the sentence would say they are here for a meeting. So and must be describing meeting. Well, annual is also describing meeting because how often does this meeting occur? What kind of meeting is this? It's an annual meeting. So and annual are both adjectives describing meeting. And that leads me to another point. You can have more than one adjective in a sentence, and you could have more than one adjective next to each other, like look at that tall, blue-eyed man. Tall and blue-eyed are both adjectives, and they're both describing man, and they can be right next to each other. And sometimes you need to put a comma in between those two adjectives. But the main point I want you to get there is that two adjectives can be right next to each other, describing the same word. All right, let's look at another example, our last example. That is the right choice. So this one's a little bit harder than the other ones, but if you look at choice right here, okay, what word is describing choice? Right is describing choice, because this isn't talking about right or left. This is talking about correct or incorrect. So the author is saying that is the correct choice. Now, one last note about adjectives. Adjectives aren't always vital to a sentence. Like, you can remove them and the sentence still makes sense. So if we take income out of this sentence, you can read the sentence as, how much tax do you have to pay? That sentence still makes sense without the adjective. They are here for a meeting. So a lot of times you need articles in a sentence to still make sense. So if we leave annual or an in the sentence, but take annual out, the sentence still makes sense as they are here for a meeting. In this sentence, if you were to remove right, the sentence wouldn't make as quite as much sense. It would say that is the choice, which by itself that sentence makes sense, but you don't understand anymore that that's a correct choice. So I hope you get my point from that, is that adjectives are important to a sentence because they give us a further description of another word in a sentence. But many times you can remove that adjective from the sentence and the sentence will still make sense. A preposition is basically a word that can't stand alone because it wouldn't make sense by itself. Some examples of a preposition would be in, under, or around. You notice these words can't stand by themselves because they don't make sense by themselves. There's not enough information there. So that's where the prepositional phrase comes into play. A prepositional phrase might look like in the tree or around the corner. So right here, in would be a preposition, and tree is what we call the object of the preposition. Because right here, if we just have the preposition in, we're wondering in what? It's in the tree. Or around the corner. Around is a preposition, and corner is the object of the preposition. We don't know what's around. It's around the corner. So prepositional phrases just come in sentences, oftentimes at the end of a sentence. So we could say, the squirrel is in the tree. Here again, in is the preposition, tree is the object of the preposition, and squirrel is the subject of the sentence. So if we just have the preposition, this kind of leaves us hanging. We're wondering the squirrel is in what? So tree is the object of the preposition because it tells where the squirrel, or what the squirrel is in. So there's lots of prepositions out there, way too many for me to name right now. But I'm going to teach you a trick to help you remember prepositions. All right, there's a tree I drew. That's about the best I can do. But think about a tree and a squirrel. Okay, think about all the things the squirrel can do when near a tree. And that'll help you remember prepositions. Because a squirrel could be under a tree, when under is a preposition. It could be in a tree, or around a tree, or upon a tree, or behind a tree, beside a tree, next to a tree, beneath a tree, over a tree, toward a tree, past a tree, or by a tree. So all those words I listed, by, past, toward, those are all prepositions. And so by remembering a squirrel and its relationship to a tree, it may seem kind of silly, but that can help you remember many of the prepositions. The sentence is the basic unit of communication in English. An English sentence has two parts, the subject and the predicate. The subject identifies the topic of the sentence, and the predicate comments on that topic. The subject must be a noun or a phrase or clause acting as a noun, and the predicate must include a verb. So we have an example here. Fred and his wife like to cook. So the subject here is Fred and his wife. Here we have Fred and wife, which are both nouns. And so that's the topic of the sentence. The topic of the sentence here is Fred and his wife, because they are the ones that are going to be doing the action. Now, the predicate here is like to cook. And the predicate must include a verb. And so the verb here is like. And then the predicate comments on the topic of the sentence. So here the topic is Fred and his wife, and the predicate is commenting, saying that Fred and his wife like to cook. Now, the purpose of a sentence refers to its function. Does the sentence state a fact or an opinion? Does it ask a question? Does it give a command? Or does it show excitement? And so the first type of sentence is declarative, and it makes a statement and ends with a period. Animals have their own language. That's a declarative sentence. And then an interrogative sentence asks a question and ends with a question mark, like, do animals have their own language? An imperative sentence gives a command or makes a request, and it ends with a period or an exclamation point. Like here we have carry that box. Now you may be thinking that this sentence does not have a noun in it acting as the subject. Well, many times in imperative sentences, there's an understood you as the subject. So we actually could write this sentence as, you carry that box. But we can leave you out and just write carry that box, and we know that the subject is actually you. And then there's exclamatory sentences, like how beautiful she is. So an exclamatory sentence shows sudden or strong feeling, and it ends with an exclamation point. So again, the four types of sentences are declarative, interrogative, imperative, and exclamatory. Sentences can be classified into two types. There are independent clauses and dependent clauses. So an independent clause contains a subject and a verb. But further than that, it is a complete thought. In other words, it is a standalone unit. It's not a sentence fragment. So an example is the sentence, she walked. It's a short sentence, but it is a complete thought. It's an independent clause because first we have a subject, she, and then we have a verb, walked. So we have a subject and a verb, and then it's also a complete thought. This doesn't leave you hanging. It's not a sentence fragment. It's a standalone unit. She walked. That gives you information, and it doesn't leave you wanting more information. Then there are dependent clauses. This is an incomplete thought. Because Martha wanted to get exercise, she walked. So from because all the way to exercise is a dependent clause. Because Martha wanted to get exercise. It's incomplete. You need more information. It's a sentence fragment by itself. So it's an incomplete thought. Now notice here that there still is a subject and a verb. There's the subject Martha and the verb wanted. The issue here is that to be an independent clause, not only does it have to contain a subject and a verb, but it has to be a complete thought. So this clause right here passes the first test of being an independent clause, but it does not pass the second test because it's an incomplete thought. So how do you fix this problem? Because you can't stop the sentence right here because you would have a sentence fragment. So you add, she walked. Now we learned earlier that this is an independent clause. We have a subject and a verb, and it is a complete thought. So by adding this independent clause to the dependent clause, you now have a fully functioning sentence. Now you have a complete thought here. You have a complete sentence. Now, what made this a dependent clause? It's the word because. Because is what's called a marker word. Some other marker words are while, after, and since. And these words turn clauses into dependent clauses. If you were to take because out, you would have Martha wanted to get exercise, which would give you a subject, a verb, and a complete thought, making it an independent clause. But because the word because is here, it's now a dependent clause, and so it's dependent on an independent clause in order to be complete. So independent clauses are independent, they can stand alone. Dependent clauses need more information to be a complete sentence. So if you take the word because out, it's a dependent clause. And so you can think about ways to use these other words. Like you could say, after we ate lunch, we went for a run. After we ate lunch is a dependent clause because of the word after. And so you can try plugging in these other marker words to make dependent clauses. But whenever you have a dependent clause, you have to add something to it to make it a fully functioning sentence that is a complete thought. So that is a look at independent and dependent clauses. Linking verbs do not express action. Instead, linking verbs express a state of being. So you have action verbs and linking verbs. And so linking verbs are reserved for expressing a state of being. So an example is, John was a doctor. Was here is a linking verb, and it's expressing a state of being, John being a doctor. And then the grapefruit here is too sour. The grapefruit is too sour. So is the linking verb here, and again it's expressing a state of being because it's describing grapefruit. So in addition to was and is, some other linking verbs are am, are, were, be, being, and been. Now, a noun or an adjective is going to follow a linking verb. So when an adjective follows a linking verb, it describes the subject. So an example is, this fruit is mushy. So we already know that is a linking verb. And so we look at the word following the linking verb, and we know it has to be a noun or an adjective. And we know that mushy is an adjective, and so it must be describing the subject. And sure enough, mushy is describing the subject, which is fruit. Now, when a noun follows a linking verb, it renames the subject. So here we have he is a doctor. Again, the linking verb is, and so the word following it is doctor. And so we know that doctor is a noun, so it must be renaming the subject. And sure enough it is, because doctor and he are interchangeable here because they're referring to the same person. Now, some sense-related verbs can also act as linking verbs, such as feel, look, smell, sound, and taste. And then there's some other verbs in general that can sometimes act as linking verbs, like appear, become, grow, and seem. And so we have some verbs that can be either an action verb or a linking verb, depending on their meaning in a sentence. Some examples are appear, become, feel, grow, look, smell, sound, and taste. So right here we're using the verb grew. So here is an example of it as a linking verb. Mary grew ill. And so a linking verb is going to have a noun or an adjective following it. So here we have ill, which is an adjective. And so since it's an adjective, it must be describing the subject. And sure enough it is. It's describing Mary. It's saying that Mary is ill. Now here we have an action verb. We grew tomatoes. It's the same word, but this time it's acting as an action verb. Now pretend for a second that it is a linking verb. We look at the word tomatoes and we see that it's a noun, so it must be renaming the subject. Well, we and tomatoes aren't interchangeable because we and tomatoes are not the same thing. So we know that grew here must be an action verb. So you just have to base it off the context of a sentence when you're trying to decide whether a verb is acting as a linking verb or an action verb. But when you come up to these words up here, these verbs are always going to be linking verbs. But when you come to sense-related verbs as well as some other verbs, they can act as a linking or action verb. The sentence is the basic unit of communication in English. Parts of speech identify the words which make up a sentence. So some examples of parts of speech are nouns, verbs, adjectives, adverbs, pronouns, articles, interjections, prepositions, and conjunctions. So one group of words that we have is nouns, verbs, adjectives, adverbs, and pronouns. those words perform essential functions within a sentence. In addition to performing essential functions, they also provide content. So they give the sentence its content, which makes sense because you have the nouns and the pronouns, which act as subjects, and then you have your verbs, which obviously act as verbs in the sentence. In every sentence, you need a subject and a verb, which gives you the topic of the sentence, and then the verb tells more about that topic. And so you can understand how these parts of speech right here perform essential functions and provide content. And then we also have another group of words, or another group of parts of speech called the prepositions and conjunctions. And so those words connect sentences. And they connect one part to another. And when I talk about one part, I'm talking about one part of a sentence. So these prepositions and conjunctions can connect sentences to each other, and then within a sentence, they can connect one part, either one idea or one action, to another idea or action. Now, some words function only as one part of speech. However, many words can function as two or more parts of speech. Just depending on the context of the sentence, a word will be either one part of speech or another part of speech. And so that's a look at the different parts of speech in a sentence. There are three verb tenses that I want to take a look at. And those verb tenses are present perfect, past perfect, and future perfect. So the present perfect is used to emphasize the completion of an action in the very recent past. So here's an example. I have just purchased a necklace. So this is something that was completed in the very recent past. It was just completed. The person just purchased a necklace. Now, the present perfect can also be used to indicate an action begun in the past and continued to the present moment. So here's an example of that. Sam has lived in the same house for 10 years. So this is talking about something that is happening now and may have happened for a long time, but the reason we're still calling it the present perfect is because it's coming up all the way till the present. And then we have the past perfect, which indicates how two finished actions are related in time. So the example here is before he went blind, Milton had written Paradise Lost. So we're looking at two actions here, Milton going blind and Milton writing Paradise Lost. Both of these are finished actions. And so this sentence is showing that Milton wrote Paradise Lost before he went blind. So here, the first completed action is using the past perfect, while the second action is using the simple past. And then we come to future perfect, which indicates an action to be finished before a future time. So the example for that is, I will have finished the book before I take the exam. So this is an action that has not happened yet, but is going to eventually be finished. And the sentence is telling the reader before what event that action is going to be completed. See, the writer is saying they're going to finish the book before the event of taking the exam. So that's a look at present perfect, past perfect, and future perfect verb tenses. Pronouns replace nouns. This sentence says, Dad is at his office. We could also say, he is at his office. These two sentences have the same meaning because he replaces dad, but they're both talking about the same person. Now, when dealing with pronouns, you have something called an antecedent. An antecedent is the noun that a pronoun replaces. So here, dad is the antecedent, because later we have this pronoun he, which replaces dad. Now there are many pronouns, so I'm going to go ahead and list most of those. I, you, he, she, it, we, they, me, you, him, her, it, us, them, my, your, his, her, its, our, their, mine, yours, his, hers, ours, theirs, myself, herself, ourselves, and himself. So those are a list of pronouns that you're probably pretty familiar with. So notice here, his is also a pronoun. So dad is the antecedent for both his and he. Now, why do we use antecedents? Why don't we just always use that noun? Well, take a look at this example. Tom plays soccer. Tom is very athletic. It's kind of redundant or annoying to say Tom every time. So instead, we can replace Tom, which is now an antecedent, for he. Tom plays soccer. He is very athletic. Because we just mentioned Tom, we know who he is talking about. Now again, you always need an antecedent, because if we said he plays soccer, he is very athletic, we don't know who he is. So you need an antecedent. You need that noun first, and then from there, you can use pronouns. Now as soon as you talk about someone else, as soon as you use a new noun, you need to use that noun again before you use a pronoun. So we could say, Tom plays soccer. He is very athletic. Sam plays soccer too. Now, if we were to say, he likes basketball, then who would he stand for? He right here is is a pronoun. And so what's the antecedent? Are we talking about Sam? Or are we talking about Tom? Most likely, people are going to think you're talking about Sam because that's the last noun you used. So if you were talking about Tom, then you would need to actually use his name right here. So pronouns only work as long as there is only one noun in the picture. As soon as you use a new noun, you need to use that old noun again before you can use an antecedent. Now look at this sentence. People should wash its cars. You want to make sure your pronouns agree with your noun. You want to make sure they agree with their antecedent. So here, people is the antecedent, its is the pronoun. But they chose the wrong pronoun here. This should say their cars. Because when we use the word its, that's a singular form. It's like they're referring to one person. But here, since we're talking about people, we're talking about lots of people, or more than one person, we need to use the pronoun their because that's plural. That refers to more than one person. So again, that's a quick look at pronouns. And pronouns replace nouns. An alliteration is a stylistic or literary technique. It's basically when successive words begin with the same sound or the same letter. So consider this sentence. She walked through the thick, thorny grass. Notice that through, the, thick, and thorny all start with TH. And so remember the definition of an alliteration are words that begin with the same sound or the same letter. In this case, they begin with the same letter and they start off with the same sound. So that's why this sentence is an example of an alliteration. Now, I said this was a literary technique, and literary techniques generally are there for a reason. In this case, it's to show the difficultness of getting through the grass, because saying 4 words that start with a TH in a row is somewhat difficult. It's kind of a tongue twister. Through the thick, thorny grass. Through the thick, thorny grass. I couldn't say that 10 times fast because it's difficult. And that's the point of the author here. They're trying to help the reader understand the difficulty of walking through this grass by making it difficult to say. And so this technique is used in the opposite way around in poetry. Many times letters or sounds that sound good 3 or 4 times in a row are used to give the poetry a musical sound so that it sounds very pleasant to the ear. Take a look at another example. Right here it says glassy globes of glitter. Here the author is trying to describe someone's beautiful eyes. So they use the phrase glassy globes of glitter. So this is an alliteration because these 3 words all start with GL. Now, of course, you may be thinking, okay, it said successive words, and right here, of is in between those. Well, it's okay for one word in there not to start with the same sound. That's all right. But glassy globes of glitter are the words we're focusing on here. Now, the the two letters it starts out with are GL, and GL is difficult to say in a row. It's kind of like the effect up here. But in this case, we're not talking about something that's difficult. We're talking about something that's beautiful, some pretty eyes. And so the author shouldn't have used these words because it makes it sound like the eyes aren't very pretty. Because up here, the purpose was to make it hard for the reader to say because they were talking about how terrible the grass is. But if you're talking about how beautiful something is, then the words describing it should also sound beautiful. So the writer could still use an alliteration, but they should pick letters or sounds that sound better when they are repeated. A figure of speech is one type of literary technique that's sometimes used to enhance a text or provide clarity, but sometimes a figure of speech can reduce clarity and make it hard to determine the actual meaning of the word. A figure of speech is basically a word or phrase that departs from straightforward, literal language. So if a word is used in a figure of speech, you wouldn't be able to look up the definition of that word in the dictionary. Well, you could look up the definition of the word, but it wouldn't be the correct definition in this context. Instead, the definition of the word used in a figure of speech is drawn from the text around the word, the context it's used in, basically. Look at this sentence, I'm going to crown you. I'm going to crown you could have 4 different possible meanings. It could mean I'm going to place a literal crown on your head. It could mean I'm going to symbolically exalt you to the place of kingship. I'm going to punch you in the head with my clenched fist. I'm going to put a second checker to signify that it has become a king. So here, I'm going to crown you is a figure of speech because it departs from straightforward literal language. I'm going to crown you doesn't necessarily imply what is going to happen. Thus, it's a figure of speech because there's several possible meanings. And the reader just has to determine the meaning of this figure of speech from the context around it. Because in some passage, this sentence is going to be surrounded by other sentences. And if the person's talking in the context of board games, then the reader could probably assume that I'm going to crown you means I'm going to put a second checker on. Or if the passage mainly talks about kings and queens, then the reader could imply that I'm going to crown you means I'm going to place a literal crown on your head. The reader just has to use the context to determine the meaning of a figure of speech. A sentence can be identified according to its structure. So the 4 different types of structures are simple sentence, compound sentence, complex sentence, and compound complex sentence. So a simple sentence is made up of just an independent clause. An independent clause is a clause that can stand by itself. So here's an example. It rained yesterday. So we have a subject here, it, and a verb, rained. And so this sentence isn't dependent on anything else to be a complete sentence. It's a sentence in its own right because it can stand alone. It rained yesterday is a grammatically correct sentence. So we call that an independent clause. Now, a compound sentence is made up of 2 or more independent clauses. Now, I'm just going to write here IC for independent clause. And so an example of a compound sentence is she likes to eat fruit and I like to eat vegetables. So notice here that we have a subject and a verb. She likes to eat fruit, and a subject and a verb. I like to eat vegetables. So this is an independent sentence because it could be a sentence by itself, and this is an independent sentence because we could just say, I like to eat vegetables, and that's a sentence by itself. But notice here, we have them joined together by a comma and the conjunction and. And so there's a few ways you can join 2 independent clauses together. One is by that example right there, by a comma and a conjunction. And so and is a conjunction as well as words like for, but, so, and yet. And then we can also join 2 independent clauses by just a semicolon. So right here we could take out the comma and just put a semicolon. It's less common, but it's still grammatically correct. And another way is just to put a conjunction with no comma. Now that wouldn't really be grammatically correct in this sentence right here, but I'm going to show you a sentence in a little bit where this would be appropriate. You only need to do that when you have 2 short independent clauses being joined together. Now the third sentence structure is a complex sentence. It has 1 independent clause and at least 1 dependent clause. So I'm going to write here independent clause and at least one dependent clause. So an example of that is, because I like to drink milk, my bones are very strong. Now here you see the subject I and the verb like. So you have I like to drink milk. You have a subject and a verb, but this is not a complete sentence. This is a dependent clause because of this word right here, because. If you were to say, because I like to drink milk, that wouldn't be a complete sentence. You need something else to it to finish it out. So that's why we call this a dependent clause, because it's dependent on another clause to be complete. Now here, on the other side of this comma, we have an independent clause. Here we have a subject, bones, and a verb, are. So my bones are very strong, can stand alone. So it's joined together with this dependent clause with a comma. Now, dependent clauses can also come after the independent clause, and you could have more than one dependent clause in a complex sentence. Now, a dependent clause is usually introduced by a relative pronoun, such as who, which, that, or something else like that. Or a subordinating conjunction, maybe like although, because, or when. Now, finally, we get to the fourth sentence structure, which is a compound complex sentence, which is two or more independent clauses plus one or more dependent clauses. So we have two independent clauses and at least one dependent clause. And so an example of that is the plane arrived and we took off because we were already late. So right here we have plane as the subject and arrived as the verb. And then here we have we as the subject and took as the verb. So this is an independent clause right here because it can stand alone, and this is an independent clause. Now, right here we have a dependent clause. Now, again, we have a subject and we have a verb. We and were are the subject and verb here, but this is not an independent clause. If we were to take the word because off, it would be an independent clause. We were already late. But because of the word because, it's now a dependent clause. Now, right here, you may be thinking, we have two independent clauses here joined by just a conjunction and no comma, because what you're used to seeing is a comma right here, which that is appropriate. We could also just put a semicolon right here. That would also be appropriate to join the two independent clauses. But we can actually not use a semicolon and we can not use a comma and just have a conjunction, because this is one of the cases where, like I was saying earlier, you just need a conjunction because you have two short independent clauses. So again, the four sentence structure types are the simple sentence, the compound sentence, the complex sentence, and the compound complex sentence. Adjectives can be used to compare people, places, or things different in degree. So if you have a one-syllable adjective, you use the suffix er or s, or the words in front of it less or least. So say we have the word new, and then we want to make the comparative form of new. We add the suffix er to make it newer. And if we're trying to compare it with three or more objects, then we would put est as the suffix to make it newest. So that's the superlative form. So say you have one car and it's only a month old. You would say you have a new car. Now, if you have a car that's 1 month old and another car that's 2 months old, you would say that the 1 month old car is the newer car. Now, if you're dealing with 3 cars, one's a month old, one's 2 months old, and the other one's 3 months old, you would refer to the car that's a month old as the newest car. Now, this is in the positive sense, whichever one is newer. Now, if we're looking at this more in the negative sense, we could say the comparative form would be less new, and the superlative form would be the least new. So if you have 2 cars, again, you would refer to the one that's 2 months old, the older car, as being less new. And you would refer to the oldest car, if you have 3 or more cars, as being the least new. Now, if you have a two-syllable adjective ending in y, you use the suffix er or est, or you use the words less or least. So say you have the word hungry, you're going to drop the y and change it to I and add er. So change the y to I and add er, so you get hungrier. It's similar with the superlative form. You change the y to I and add est, so you have hungriest. So if you have one person, you would describe them as hungry. With 2 people, you would describe one person as being hungrier, or describe the other person as being less hungry. If you have 3 or more, you would describe one person as being the hungriest, or you would describe someone as being the least hungry. Now, if you have a word with 2 or more syllables, use more or most or less or least. So notice here we're no longer using suffixes. So if something is thrilling and you're comparing it with something else, you would say that one is more thrilling. And then if you have 3 or more, you would describe something as being the most thrilling. And then in the same way as before, you would describe one as being less thrilling or the least thrilling. So say you have one amusement park ride somewhere. You would describe it as thrilling. But if you're dealing with 2 rides, you would describe one as being more thrilling. But if you have a whole amusement park full of rides, you would describe one as being the most thrilling. Now, there are some words that we call irregular. And they're irregular in the way that we form their comparative and superlative. A great example of that is the word bad. The comparative form is worse than, which isn't even another form of bad. And then the superlative form is the worst. So that's a look at unequal comparison adjectives. It is important to use different types of sentences. Using different types of sentences adds variety to your writing. So by using different types of sentences, you make your writing more interesting. It's more appealing to the reader. So there's 3 types of sentences. There's the simple sentence, complex sentence, and the compound sentence. So you want to try to use all types of sentences in your writing. So a simple sentence is just a subject and a verb. This is what we'd call one independent clause. Hannah ran through the meadow. So we have the subject here, and we have the verb ran. And so that's all that's here. It's just a complete thought. It's enough to be a sentence, but it's not anything more. Then we have a complex sentence, which is an independent and a dependent clause. So I call this an independent clause because it can stand alone. It has a subject and a verb, so it's a sentence. It doesn't need anything else to make it more of a sentence. And so this says, instead of watching a movie, he read a book. So here we have a subject, he, and a verb, read. Now, he read a book could be a sentence alone. So that's the independent clause. The dependent clause is instead of watching a movie. Because instead of watching a movie isn't a sentence. I couldn't just come up to you and say, instead of watching a movie, you'd be thinking, okay, instead of watching a movie, what are you going to do? So this is the dependent clause. So together, the independent clause and the dependent clause form a complex sentence. And then we have a compound sentence, which is 2 independent clauses. So here we have the sentence, we ate burgers. So we have the subject we and the verb ate. And then we ate burgers, or then we ate dessert. So we have we as the subject and ate as the verb again. But these are 2 sentences. These are 2 independent clauses because both of these clauses could be sentences by themselves. I could come up to you and say, we ate burgers, and that would be a complete thought. Or I could say, then we ate dessert. That would be a complete thought. So by joining these 2 together, we're forming one sentence, but we're forming one sentence out of what could be 2 sentences. So that's 2 independent clauses, which makes a compound sentence. So when you use all of these, it gives your writing variety. It makes your writing more interesting. And also, by using different types of sentences, it makes your sentence length differ as well. So generally, your simple sentences are going to be kind of short, and sometimes your complex or compound sentences will be pretty long. And so by having different lengths to your sentences, it makes your writing more interesting. A noun can be a person, place, thing, or idea. So a noun that is a person could be man or Joseph. Now all nouns fit into 2 categories. All nouns are either a common noun or a proper noun. So proper nouns are specific. And we always capitalize proper nouns. So Joseph is a proper noun. It's specific. It's talking about a particular person, and we capitalize it. Now, common nouns aren't talked about quite as often as proper nouns, but they're really just the opposite of proper nouns. Common nouns are non-specific, and we don't capitalize them. So man is a common noun because it's non-specific. It's not talking about anything in particular. For place, we could put city or Chicago. So city is a common noun. It's non-specific, and Chicago is a proper noun. It's specific. Notice that city really is a category, and that's what you'll find. Many times common nouns are categories. For thing, we could put marker, and we could also put Sharpie. So marker is the common noun here. It's non-specific. Then Sharpie is the proper noun. It's specific. Not all markers are Sharpie. Sharpie refers to a specific type of marker. And then finally, we come to idea. So far, we've been talking about people, places, and things. Those are all concrete. Ideas are more abstract. So an example of a noun that is an idea would be the word honest. Ideas are intangible, whereas people, places, and things are tangible. And so when we talk about the word honest, it's an idea, it's abstract. And we don't really deal with proper nouns when it comes to ideas. So that's a look at what a noun is. Word usage, or diction, refers to the use of words with meanings and forms that are appropriate for the context and structure of a sentence. So this right here is your goal as a writer, to use words with meanings and forms appropriate for the context and appropriate for the structure of a sentence. Now, a common error in word usage occurs when a word's meaning does not fit the context of the sentence. This sentence right here says, Susie likes chips better than candy. Now, the appropriate word here is than, not then. Then is an inappropriate word for the context of the sentence. So it makes more sense to say Susie likes chips better than candy, because than is used in comparisons, while then is used in more of a chronological sense, like I went to the store, then I ate lunch. Another example would be the cat licked its coat. The correct form is the cat licked its coat. Now, its and its are homonyms, which are words that sound the same but have different meanings. And you may be thinking, anytime a word is possessive, shouldn't it have an apostrophe? Which generally that is the case, and here its should be possessive. But with the case of the word its, you only use an apostrophe when you're talking about the contraction. So right here, the sentence is saying the cat licked its coat. So that doesn't make sense, so obviously you're not supposed to use the apostrophe. Now, I just mentioned homonyms, and errors in word usage frequently occur with homonyms, which again are words that sound alike but have different meanings. So some examples of homonyms are its and its, affect and affect, and there, and there. So it's very easy for a writer to confuse these words because they sound the same. Now, some other words that are commonly confused are then and except and except. Now, these words aren't homonyms, but they're very close to being homonyms because they don't sound exactly alike, but they are pretty close, which makes determining which word to use a little bit more difficult.